Can you see this okay? I'm starting with this picture right here because I think it's really funny, and it also shows the interesting mindset of gamers, where a lot of the attributes are really pretty positive. You know, this constant drive to excel, you know, and persisting in the face of failure, and you know, being very creative and stuff. So the point is, you know, how can we validly measure some of these constructs within the measure and support some of these constructs within game environments? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And the formal title is Stealth Assessment in Games to Measure and Support Learning of So-Called 21st Century Competencies. And this is a very simple flow chart. You know, a kid is, you know, playing some game, completely immersed in gameplay, and then producing all sorts of performance data that are then captured by the log file, and then analyzed with the stealth assessment machinery, and then those updated data are then submitted to the student model, which in turn gets updated in real time with current estimates of particular competency levels, and then that provides the basis for providing feedback and other kinds of support for the learner, for the player who continues to play the game, producing data that gets captured by the log file and so on. So the problem that this research is trying to solve is that currently, at least in the United States and presumably here as well, our assessment practices are very closed up, and by that I mean they're not transparent, and they're not very open, and they're decidedly divorced from student learning over there. So a typical cycle in a classroom is you teach some stuff, you stop, you test, and you repeat. But my contention is that assessment should be open and transparent and kind of gently surround and support the learner or groups of frogs, players learning together. So there's three different claims that I'm going to make in relation to games and learning and assessment. The first is that good games absolutely can act as transformative kinds of environments to support the development of critical educational areas and also deepen meaningful learning. The second claim is that learning is at its absolute best when it's active, when it's interesting and goal-oriented and contextualized. And it turns out those are all the features of very good games. And finally, stealth assessment can be used to collect all this dynamic, real-time evidence of learning, and then use those estimates on the basis to provide learning support. So you can stop me at any time. Later on it's going to get a little abstract, and then I'm going to instantiate it all in the context of a game. So I'm going to very briefly define what I mean by 21st century competencies and also what I mean by well-designed games. I'll give an overview, a one-slide overview of something called evidence-centered design, which is very important. I'll describe stealth assessment, and then the bulk of the stuff I'm going to talk about is going to be making it all come alive or concrete as it appears within a game that we developed called Physics Playground, where we ran 3 different stealth assessments concurrently. So in terms of 21st century competencies, it's important to start thinking of new kinds of skills compared to what we've done in the past, because the world has changed so much in the past 100 years, and education has not at all. So 100 years ago, if you acquired your reading, writing, and arithmetic skills, you were considered to be sufficiently literate, because the goal back then was to prepare kids for production jobs. But today's kids, are very, very much different. So in order to be successful citizens of this interconnected world we live in, when faced with a really complex problem, we have to be able to think creatively and critically and systemically. We have to work together well in teams and communicate. I found a slide on teamwork I'll share with you if it goes there. So here's a picture of team, the I in team. Maybe something that's lost in translation. These are some of the 21st century skills that my students and I have been examining, measuring, and coming up with interventions for in the past 8-10 years. But the two I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to focus on persistence and creativity. And these two are super important, not only for success, in school and on the job and in life in general, but they're also notoriously difficult to measure well. So one of the problems that's standing in the way of schools fully embracing some of these new competencies is that there's a lack of valid and reliable assessments of, for instance, creativity and persistence. And our old ways of testing just aren't working. They're not very successful. Filling in bubbles on like a multiple choice kind of test or a self-report, Likert scale survey don't work for these kinds of complex competencies that I'm interested in. I'll give you an example of some of the problems with self-reporting. So here's kind of this is a typical Likert scale self-report. This is a very commonly used measure of openness or creativity. You respond to a number of different statements, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I have a vivid imagination. Of course I do. I had excellent ideas. Oh, strongly agree. We tend to lie on these kinds of self-report data, or we don't understand the construct in question, and so on. So there's a ton of problems with regard to self-report data, and I could talk 8 hours on that. So here's a comparison. So that was the traditional way of doing things. About a year or so ago, did anybody see this go by? There's these two panels went all over the internet. So here's a picture of knowledge, isolated dots. And here's a picture of experience. And somebody had connected some of the dots together. And people looked at it for about a week and were like, yes, that's true. And then about a week later, this picture became affixed to the other two, and it was like, yes, that is a beautiful metric. It's a good example or an indicator of creativity. Where, and I would argue that this, more performance-based metric is so much better than the self-report and traditional kinds of measures that we've been using. So I will be talking about more performance-based assessments, and Plato agrees. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than a year of conversation. So I'm going to blow through this kind of quickly, but games, probably the most succinct definition of games that I've heard was by Bernard Suits, circa 1979, and he defined a game as unnecessary obstacles that we choose to overcome, which is awesome. And a good example, of course, is golf. So with golf, it's very simple. You've got a ball, and your goal is to get it inside of a hole. And when you introduce some of the rules of the game and some of the challenges, it becomes very, very difficult and all the more compelling. So you have to hit the ball with a stick and a club on the end of it, standing 200 yards away from the hole, with the wind and all the other things. So when I'm talking about games from here on, I'm going to be talking about digital games that can be played on consoles and PCs and mobile devices. So these are just pictures of people of all ages like to play games. They're super engaging. And this, of course, is the counterpoint picture of kids in a classroom environment. So games as assessments, well, games are very engaging. They require a player to actually apply some of the things that we're interested in, the different competencies, in order to succeed in the game. And games are also ubiquitous. All kids play games. Just about all kids play games. So digital games differ on a number of dimensions: the platform, the genre, the content that's being used, but I contend that a good game is a system, and it consists of these 6 core elements. And this is taken from a number of different game design workbooks, primarily Tracy Fullerton's book on the topic, but there's a lot of agreement on this by people who work in this area. But the first one is this idea of interactive problem solving. This is the interplay between the player in the game and the player in the game. It's usually in the context of solving some very interesting problem. Good games have specific goals and rules, and this helps the player figure out what to do, when, and how. They have adaptive challenges. This is, the flow idea, or ZPD, which is the balance between the difficulty level and the player's current abilities. And a good game kind of hovers right at the outer edges of doability. Good games offer control to the player, the environment and the gameplay, provide ongoing feedback, and this, of course, is important for learning, and sensory stimuli in the form of auditory and graphic and sometimes narrative to titillate the senses. So when all these elements come together, it makes for a very engaging and almost kind of magical experience where players want to play and replay really hard games and solve and resolve different kinds of levels, because reaching goals is a highly rewarding experience. Now the question at this point is, so how can we validly measure different kinds of constructs in these game environments without mucking up the fun factor, which is a really tough issue? And that's where stealth assessment comes in. So before defining it, I'll just illustrate some of its features. First, it's intended to be seamless and ubiquitous. And by seamless, I mean that the stealth assessment code is written directly in the fabric of the game itself, so that it's invisible, and the distinction between learning and assessment is completely blurred. Ubiquitous means it's ongoing. It's intended to be formative, not summative, so it's intended to support learning and not serve as judge and jury. I think I have a quote here that's helpful. This is a distinction between formative and summative assessment. It can be used for summative purposes, but why? And it's intended to provide accurate and rich models of the learner, and it can do so because the underlying models are built with something called evidence-centered design, which I'll talk about next. So evidence-centered design, and this is formalized by my friends and colleagues Bob Mislevy, Linda Steinberg, and Russell Allman. There's two main foci. First, it provides a way to reason about assessment design, how to create excellent assessments, and it provides a way to reason about student performance. So going from left to right, and here's where David's stuff and mine start to come together, and maybe we'll get to it afterwards, but in my mind, the little c, we're not there yet. Let me get this out there, and then we'll start making connections. So it starts by articulating what's called a competency model. And this is what all you want to say about a person at the end of the day, in terms of knowledge, skills, dispositions, whatever it is that you're interested in. So it involves identifying and structuring the relevant variables. That's the green stuff right here. Theoretical, latent variables, and so on. So after that's articulated, next is the evidence model, which involves establishing specific relationships between these theoretical variables and how you're going to measure, and their associated metrics. So it's the way you're going to measure them. And I'll give lots and lots of examples of this in a second. And finally, after the evidence model comes in, you set up the task or the action model, and this involves defining the particular features of tasks that you need to build that will elicit the evidence that you need. So this is setting up the assessment now. Going in reverse lets us do diagnostics. So say a kid is playing in a game, solved a level, and they produce this series of actions right here. And that's that little yellow box. So that gets automatically submitted to the evidence model, which parses and scores those actions. So these are measurable, these are observable. So this is the land of data here, and this is the land of theory. So we've got measured data variables right here. Those then get statistically linked back up to the competency model variables. And then those updated variables get reinserted back into the competency model, which propagates throughout. And so at any time and any grain size, you know how well or poorly a person is doing. And this may be just nonsensical right now or too abstract, but I'll have illustrations in a second. So my stealth assessment idea uses evidence-centered design to create the models that are then buried into the code of the game, and it lets us extract ongoing information as a person is engaged in gameplay, makes accurate inferences about competencies, and then be able to react in immediate and helpful and targeted ways. And this is all accomplished by way of automated scoring and machine-based reasoning techniques, which I'll spend some time talking about because you all want to know about machine-based reasoning and automated scoring. I hope. Okay, so this is the concrete part of the story right here. So this is a game that we developed. This was with some funding by the Gates Foundation here. So Physics Playground is a game that was inspired by Crayon Physics Deluxe. And I tried to get the source code from the author, Petri Perho, and he originally said I could have it, and then he stopped replying to my email. So we built our own game. But it was inspired by, I love the game mechanic, that's part of it. It's a 2D computer-based game with physics simulations for things like mass and potential and kinetic energy and gravity and things like that. I'll show you the team that worked on this. This was several years ago now, and a lot of my students have grown up and gone off into other places. He's now senior software engineer at Google. She's at MIT. These two are still working on their doctorates. These two are the physicists that worked on the project, and me, Matthew Ventura, and Russell Ullman. Basically, the goal of the project was to develop, we were asked to develop a stealth assessment, and being an overachiever, I decided to do 3 running concurrently for creativity, conscientiousness, and conceptual physics understanding, in which were all embedded in Physics Playground and running at the same time. Some of the key questions that have since been replicated in several other studies are the stealth assessment measures valid? This was the most important, and thus the first question that I asked, because I could say I'm measuring creativity or whatever, but am I? So the question of validity was really important. Do kids actually learn any qualitative physics simply as a function of playing the game? There was no instruction whatsoever. It was just gameplay. And finally, do kids actually enjoy the game-based assessment? How many kids like assessments? Not very many. So we tested about 168 ninth grade students. And like I said, 3 or 4 other studies have replicated the main findings. The design was something like 4 hours of gameplay plus pre-test on a battery of external measures for creativity, conscientiousness, and physics, and the same with a matched post-test. So there's 75 levels altogether in the game, and the goal was the same across all the different levels. So the goal was to always get a green ball over to hit a red balloon. And everything in the game obeys the basic laws of physics. So what happens is a player is drawing on the screen, drawing different physical objects that come to life when they're drawn. So using a mouse and colored markers. And what the player is basically doing is inventing simple machines, things like levers and ramps and pendulums and springboards and so forth, all to get the ball over to the balloon. I've got a link at the end of it. Anybody's interested. One person has it already on the system. So players can solve problems in lots of different ways, always striving for the awesomest one. So we had to have levels that differed in terms of difficulty to accommodate all the different people that are out there. So we came up with different difficulty indices. So the relative location of the ball versus the balloon was one difficulty index. So if the balloon was above the ball, that made it harder. Obstacles in the way between the ball and the balloon, that's something that made it harder. We called the simple machines agents of force and motion in the game. So different agents of force and motion that were required to solve it was another variable that comprised a difficulty index, and the degree of novelty. So we took all the 75, 76 levels and we rated them in terms of the indices, and then we arrayed them into 7 different playgrounds, so about 10 levels in each one of the playgrounds. Another thing to point out is that one of our design decisions was to make it a nonlinear game, so in theory you could play any playground, any level in any playground, but a lot of kids, I guess because of schooling and stuff, tended to go play in a linear manner. Some people did jump around. I've got some, we'll see if any of these actually play. Here's an example of a pretty simple springboard problem, and then a little harder one right here. Okay, there's no sound in it. I don't know, can you hear? Where's your sound key on here? Let's see.
I think it's up at the maximum.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. So that was pretty straightforward. This one, can you see it okay? Mm-hmm. This is a little harder because there's a number of obstacles that are in the way. There's the leprechaun hat right there. So the person is drawing some objects, and that was too much weight that went over there. It's got to be just the right mass and trajectory. And so, and the thing is, you learn every time, every time you mess up. That stuff there. So you can either affix a weight directly to the springboard or drop a weight down. The person is trying both of them. And where the ball is when it happens, that hat, that damn hat. So at the end, you'll see little icons representing the agent that was used to solve the problem. Now, how did the system know about that? I'll talk about that in a second. So this is a general overview: success in physics playground, creativity, conscientiousness, and conceptual physics. Again, these are theoretical variables. Each one of them had a set of different facets. Again, theoretical variables. And then down at the bottom, I'll show you examples in a second, are all the different indicators. And these are the things the person did within a game that provides evidence that's then fed into the competency models. So here's one for creativity. What I did was I had, I'm losing my voice, I had an adopt a competency kind of set up where I would have a grad student adopt a competency for 6 months and do a deep dive, do a thorough literature review for at least 6 months, going back in this case 100 years. So creativity basically, so after the literature review they came up with this graphical representation, and then we submitted the literature review and the representation to experts in the area. I think we sent this to James Kaufman and Bob Sternberg, who gave us some feedback we tweaked. And so we ended up with this. Creativity has some cognitive stuff and some non-cognitive stuff associated with it. So with cognitive skills, and again, the stuff over here are the theoretical constructs. Things like fluency, that's also known as brainstorming or divergent thinking, your ability to think of a lot of different things. Another one is flexibility, that's the opposite of functional fixedness. And another one is originality, and that's the novelty of your ideas. So in theory, I say, how many different ways can I use this pitcher of water? Okay, and you come up with 30 different ways in 60 seconds, which is pretty amazing. And I come up with 6. But maybe your 30 different ways are really boring and lame, so you would have high fluency and kind of lower on that. And my 6, I have 4 of them be highly unusual. And so forth. So those are the theoretical variables. And then these are just samples right here of the observables or the indicators associated with each one. And I'll just pull out one to illustrate. For originality right here, what would a person do in the environment that would demonstrate originality? There's a whole lot of things. Here's one of them. So just like with the difficulty index, we had some creativity rubrics right here. So remember they played the game for 4 hours, and there's a level editor that's part of the game itself. So after 3 hours of gameplay, we set them up in the level editor and we told them, create a level, a really cool level for your friend to play. You have 30 minutes, go for it, do whatever you want, make it super cool. And then they submitted their, and the only criteria was the level had to be solvable. So you can see a stark contrast here. This was one of the submissions right here, and it had a really high creativity, and these are some of the variables that we measured on aesthetics, originality. This was the inverse of frequency. And then this one here got a really low score because it was, boring and.
Wait, sorry, but these criteria, do we find them back in the model that you showed us before?
Pardon me?
These criteria then, are they in the model that you showed us before?
No,
These are
this is
others.
different. This is
Okay.
outside. These are for the indicators. For the indicators, we score them with rubrics. And this is one of the rubrics that we use. For things like, I'll show you in persistence, it makes it a little easier to show you. So the rubric, okay, so let me go to the next one, which is conscientiousness. And we pretty much just focused on persistence, which in the literature is the big main driver of conscientiousness. So conscientiousness consists of persistence, perfectionism, organization, and carefulness. Again, we just focused on persistence. And some of our collection of observables were things like time on difficult problems. So for instance, on the self-report measure, it could say, when faced with a difficult problem, I always stick with it. Yes, I do. But do you really? So the question here is, we knew we had all the duration on every single problem, and we knew what its difficulty level is. So we know exactly how much time they spent on a difficult problem. Or if you left a problem and came back to it, the number of revisits was another indicator of it. So each one of those indicators had its own way of measuring things. And this example right here just shows you want to see it? I don't know. I have some time. Okay, I speeded this up 8 times the speed because it took the person about 20 minutes to actually solve the problem. But they go through all sorts of different attempts. They knew they had to elevate the ball to get up there. It has the addition of some additional mass associated with it, which they had to overcome. So they're trying, all sorts of sides and different amounts of mass. But again, like with any, any game, when you finally solve a problem that's been giving you a headache, it feels really good.
So they also had the possibility to give up?
Yeah, they could leave at any time. Those data are being collected. The massive log file is collecting everything, and I just got to a wrong place right here. This is where I need to be. Okay. So the last model, and this is a very simplified mini version of the model for the physics part of the story. We were looking at Newton's physics, Newton's 3 laws, which broke out into issues related to angular momentum and potential and kinetic energy. And then our simple machines, or our agents, were pendulums and levers and springboards and ramps. And for each one of these 4 agents, we had the same set of indicators for it, like, did the person get a silver or gold trophy? Did they get a silver trophy on the problem? That's when you just manage to kludge your way through to a solution, just get there. A gold trophy is given when you solve it under par. It's an elegant solution. And they're told that gold trophies are worth double the points of silver, so that motivates some people to go for gold, which takes a lot of effort. People spend a lot of time to get the gold, and everybody's different. Then there are some other indicators as well for that. So the gold trophy information, and this is, again, in 4 hours of gameplay, you can solve a lot of levels. And how many gold trophies and of what kind of simple machine did you get? So that collectively would tell, would be a proxy measure for mastery. won't go through this except to say that, again, the simple machines that we focused on in the game were things like ramp and lever and pendulum and springboard. Is everybody familiar with simple machines? Anybody need any?
I've got another question.
Yes.
Did you only things on single participants, or did you also try them in groups?
In this study, it was individuals. I have a study going that's starting right now this month, where we're doing it in groups of 3, and they each have a different role and they rotate. So one's a player, one's a recorder, one's a questioner. So I wanted to do it individually right now because the very first question, so this was an initial study involved, I had to get the stealth assessment right before I started doing other kinds of manipulations. So that's what the focus here is, on the learning and the quality of the assessment. But good question. And it's always fun to play with your friends. I mean, more heads are often, better than one. So the problem is that because it's a drawing game, everybody draws differently. So how I may draw a pendulum or a lever can be way different than you or you or you. So we had to come up with a system where the computer was able to automatically score a drawn object and classify it in terms of one of those agents of force and motion, which was kind of tough at first. We were talking for a while, for many hours, about computer vision, and we realized that nobody on the team had that expertise. So we came up with a very, I think, clever, elegant solution to it, and it turns out that our agent identification system is actually now about 98% accuracy compared with human ratings, where what the computer is saying that you drew is actually what a human would say you drew. So it turns out the simple solution to the problem was that each agent turns out to be characterized by the presence and absence of particular features. So I'll show you, this is just a snapshot of a log file. This is an enlarged version. This is a single level in the game. So for example, it's a diving board level. They took 130 seconds in total on this level, which is about 2 minutes. They ultimately solved it. They solved it with a silver solution. And this row here, the agent vector, is where the computer is saying at timestamp 61.78, the person drew a springboard, didn't work. Then at 98.8, they drew another springboard and so forth. How the computer knew they drew a springboard? It's because of the unique thing. So we set up this giant table. I'm going to just zoom in on one of these here. There was 2 different phases to the identification process. The first is, and this is for pendulum strike. So how does the computer know that a person drew a pendulum? Well, a pendulum is characterized primarily by having a single pin that rotates on its axis. So if these conditions hold, the first phase is accomplished. That's the weak hypothesis. The computer is, I think the person's drawing a pendulum. So the object has a single pin. The object is rotated more than 20 degrees and it has non-zero rotational velocity. And then if this condition holds, bam, it's a firm hypothesis, and that's the identify trigger. So then if these hold and the ball is moved moderately, then we shall call it a pendulum. And in fact, judged again, 98% accuracy is sweet. So I think this is a video of 4 different, this is just to show you what the different agents look like. So this is the very first level in the game itself. So here the person is drawing a ramp solution. It's very simple, and that's the first problem. Get some confidence in their pockets. And then this is the first one you played. This is and you can watch when they solve it, a little icon will appear up there, and you can see it's a little icon of a pendulum there, and it was gold because it was under par. The person is using the person is me. I did the solutions for the video because I want them to be done. But using the dorsal fin as an automatic fulcrum, and there is a lever. Here's, I think, a springboard solution. Ball's coming down. There's a tutorial at the beginning of it that guides them through drawing the 4 different agents. Very basic. It also teaches some of the basic game mechanics, like how to nudge the ball, how to make a pin, that's a left click in the environment, and so forth. So that's the first one. Yes?
Have you investigated the last 5 or 2% you cannot reliably classify? Are they pretty good or poor or just average solutions?
No, they're and it's probably about only like 1 out of 100 different times have I ever seen a mismatch between what my eyeballs construe and what the computer is saying, or what any of the other people's. So I don't see anything consistent.
No, I mean,
may
not
just
performance-wise, like they could be, I'm just making this up, of
Yeah.
course, very creative solutions. You know,
Oh
they're
no,
not-
that's a different story.
that's a different story.
No, that's and we do pay attention to that. For instance, that's a different story. You could use any kind of solution, but we have one of the variables in here, I didn't show it, it's called applicable agents, where we as experts who created the game knew which, like this problem can be solved by a lever and a pendulum. That's it. And then we see a kid solve it with a ridiculous ramp solution. And we're like, wow, we didn't anticipate that. So now we set ramp solution as one of the alternatives. But it's so rare. So for creativity, earlier I showed you the rubrics. But one of the other things is we know exactly what the expert solution is in terms of the ball trajectory. So one of the variables in the list was ball trajectory. So we know all the XY coordinate space of where the expert ball goes. So we know what the solution, the kid's solution is. And so when you do an overlay, you can look at the discrepancy between the expert. And if they solve the problem with this wacky, disparate solution, that's highly original, and that's good.
Could you go back to the slide where you had what data is being recorded out of every level?
Oh, in the log file, the level log file. I'm going to come up to a session level log file, which takes the level stuff and adds it.
Okay.
Did you have a particular question about that? Because I want to get to the Bayes nets.
Okay, we can discuss it later.
Okay, and hold that thought because I relish good questions. So
Alright.
thank you. So where were we? So now evidence accumulation is the part of the story where we've got stuff going on, level by level, information is collected, and we've got to accumulate it somehow. So that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So I showed you the log file at the level. So data at the level is summed over all the instances, and this is done in real time. So bam, it's done. This is the raw indicator data for things like time they spent on the level, 130 seconds, number of restarts, etc. So a lot of variables. In some cases, we had variables that spanned a session, which was from log in to log out. And so, in an hour session, you may have 8 problems solved, you may have just 1. So we collected number of levels attempted, applicable agents, and so forth. So what we did then was we created cut scores from the frequency distributions of the raw observables. This from a series of pilot tests. Then for each indicator, we created low, medium, and high levels to feed into the Bayes net. And let me show you what I mean by this. You're not expected to be able to see this, but what I want you to see is that the stuff in beige, sort of near the top, again, are the theoretical variables, the things that we want to predict or estimate. And the stuff down in green at the bottom are some of the indicators there. I'm going to just blow this up right here so you can see it. So for instance, for the physics part of the story, we had potential kinetic energy and conservation of angular momentum. And under that, we had understanding ramps, levers, pendulums, and springboards. And under that, we had our different indicators related to did they get gold, silver, or no trophy for each of the different agents. And this is an instantiated version. So for a given level, this is at one point in time, a person solved that level with both a lever and a pendulum. and then those data get sent back into the Bayes net, and it gets percolated all the way up to the top. So, how many people are familiar with Bayes nets? Couple. Bayes nets are a representation. This is a probabilistic network of the estimates. These are from the competency model, where we divide it into, you can divide it any which way you want, but we divide it into high, medium, and low. And then you've got, so these are theoretical, like the probability of you being high on this is 0.94. That means that the system or whomever is super confident that it's, that it's really a big deal, that you're probably very highly probable that you're high on this particular dimension. I could show this example. Let's see. This is the problem that was solved with two different agents. The first and you can see what the par is, like if you solve it with a single item. This is a kind of easy problem. Then you solve it under par and you get a gold. So this person is initially solving it with a pendulum and getting a gold trophy there. And then they decide to solve it again. You can solve it as many times in many different ways as you want. Meanwhile, points are accruing up down the scoreboard, so you can monitor your progress. So now they're deciding to try to do a lever solution on the same problem. And so on. So I'm going to blow through the validity part of the story to get to the results. But basically, what we were looking at was, do our 3 stealth assessment measures that are operating within the game, do they have any basis in reality? Do they correlate with any of these external measures? And we expected, to be reasonably high, but not too high because of all the flaws and limitations of some of the external measures. So for creativity, we used some standard and already validated external measures. The openness self-report, I showed you examples from that earlier. Wallace and Kogan's alternate uses test, like how many different ways can you use X. And we also use that test for originality. Circle your top 2 most original responses. These are just pictures of the openness survey. For conscientiousness, we had the self-report measure of conscientiousness from the IPIP, International Personality Guiding Pool. And we also used a performance-based measure of conscientiousness, which is an adaptation of Eisenberger's anagram test. And so this is the self-report for conscientiousness for the anagram test. What he did, he had 8 different anagrams. 4 were easy and 4 were hard. And what we did, we had a time limit of 2 minutes. And so they could solve the problem or they could skip it. They could take up to 2 minutes or not. So what we did is we threw the data away for all the easy problems and we just looked at the data for the 4 hard problems, with the notion being that if somebody really stayed the full 2 minutes, then they tended to be more persistent than, oh, I don't know what that is, I'm going to skip it. And we didn't want to confound that with verbal skills, so we came up with a picture comparison task too. We're the same thing. We had 4 easy and 4 super difficult. They were impossible tasks. Where the easy ones, the salient features that differed, were really salient between the two. So out of, find 5 features that differ, and the 5 features were all real easy, missing an eyeball and stuff. But for the difficult problems, we said, okay, find the 5 features that differ. And 4 of them were pretty easy to find. And the last one, I had removed a single pixel from the picture. So you couldn't find it. It was impossible. And that was tough to get through the IRB, but I did. But again, the same idea. We wanted to see how long people would spend trying to find the fifth thing. So with our physics test, 24 items, Some were constructive response, like, drawing the trajectory here. Other ones, most of them were multiple choice kinds of items. And this was inspired by the force concept inventory that's used widely for this kind of qualitative physics stuff. So, here's two pictures, and which one will the ball go farther or fastest or whatever. And these were created by two physics experts. So the question is, how did playing physics playground affect the quality of the assessment, learning, and enjoyment? So in terms of the validity question, we correlated the in-game measures of mastery, in this case, the number of gold trophies received for the different variables, to our external measures of physics, and we found that the very significant correlations, which was a relief. And we also found, remember, physics at the very top was a function of this, which is a function of that. So we took our big daddy node of physics at the very top. The EAP is expected a posteriori. That's a single value, ranged from -1 to +1. And that correlated significantly with the external measure. So that was really nice. In terms of validity, the problem, I'm sorry, in terms of reliability, because it was a nonlinear game, to figure reliability, usually you have a pool of shared items and you look at the reliability of them. But in this case, people solve different levels. So we started out by computing a confirmatory factor analysis to look at the factor structure, and a single factor fit the data well. Low air variance, healthy loadings there. And we also computed interclass correlations, and that's the internal cohesiveness within each of those categories. The gold trophy by agent, and that too was very nice to see. We computed another interclass correlation by a different division of the pie, easy, medium, and gold, easy, medium, and hard gold trophy data. And then at some point I realized I could compute Cronbach's alpha, so I identified 110 people that solved the same shared set of 29 problems and computed a Cronbach's alpha with 87. So the good news is that the data the stealth assessment data seemed to be valid and reliable. And in terms of learning, from pre-test to post-test, we saw significant improvement. This is after 4 hours of gameplay. And the key here is there was absolutely no instruction at all. It was just gameplay. And there wasn't anything going on in the classroom related to it. And kids, on a scale of 1 to 5, kids liked it, and the note here, which I'm happy about, is males and females enjoyed the game equally, which was good news. That's not always the case. It's kind of an exception to the rule. So, wrapping it up, I think it's important to prepare kids to, succeed in 21st century skills that require us, valuing new, different kinds of competencies. So if we do that, we have to design assessments that are valid and reliable. Why not make it fun and engaging and enable learning within these complex kinds of environments? So some of the next steps, I've got several grants in right now. So right now I'm comfortable that we're getting good evidence for accurate real-time estimates and different kinds of competencies. The information can be used by teachers, who can then adjust instruction and get good feedback. It can be used by the system itself to figure out what level to give to you that would be most suited. It could be used by students to reflect on how they're doing via the progress indicators. A study that we just finished and published with my colleagues Sydney DeMello and Ryan Baker. We used Physics Playground again, and we collected a number of different data in addition to the in-game log file data. We also had the webcams turned on that were recording their faces, and then we had a stream, and we had to synchronize all the data sets together. So the webcam data captured everybody's expressions that Sydney then went and ran facets on to identify different sequences of affective states. So we had affective states tied to the log file data, and then we had Bronc running, which is Ryan Baker's protocol, observational protocol. So we had these three data sets coalescing together, and we ran some, this is a model that we just published, is a structural equation model. And what we were looking at is what's the relationship between persistence and some of the in-game behaviors and different affective states and pre-test and post-test. And the answer's there. The thing that's kind of interesting to me is I'm only at the beginning part of understanding all this, the affective literature, but in my naive understanding, I thought, well, we don't want people to be frustrated, but it turns out frustration has a positive relation to the in-game behaviors, which in turn has a positive relation to post-test.
Can I quickly comment on this before I forget it, though?
Okay.
There's some related research, I don't remember the name, but they found that dying in a game,
Dying in a game.
yes, like, dying
Yeah,
over and over,
yeah.
creates sort of sense of security in a way and relief. So
Relief
might
in
be
what?
Relief, sort of.
Oh, relief.
Yeah. So which might be an interesting background history for you. I'll try and dig that up. But that was such a surprising finding there that they were sort of also amazed at, well, how can this be kind of.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I die all the time. Usually my action is down, not relief. I think that's it. Yes, and I can put up a link to the game, a Unity version that we